Thank you very much, Margaret. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. So you guys all just met like half an hour ago, but you've all been doing business with each other's companies. And I want to know, since this is about the business side of the innovation side of the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, how many deals have you guys done with each other in the last 30 or 45 minutes?
We can't tell you.
They were actually talking about something where they had been co-investors in something, and you know, I don't want to go into like gossip, but Genentech killed a drug or something. No, maybe that's not true. But let me just open up a conversation here just on the subject of when you think about the innovation pipeline and how to think about good investments, how you look at that continuum. Carol, you and I were talking about this. I'm really interested. I want to just have an uncomfortable conversation for a minute. When you look at a new opportunity in a sector, are you looking at the profits to be made in a disease, or are you looking at the human value, the social value of actually moving the needle on something society needs? Leon?
I think it's both, right? I think especially in this day and age, in order to have a successful commercial drug, it actually has to have a pretty significant impact on that patient population. So, there were periods of times when discovering and developing drugs that have marginal benefits could actually have a commercial space in the world. I think that is changing. I think we really do have to, shoot the moon a little bit every time that we're investing in a new therapeutic.
Drew?
I think I would agree with both. I would just add that one of the great themes I think we're party to collectively is this evolution of life sciences, which was named sort of the life science sector originally, insofar as we funded science projects, has evolved to a point where the majority of companies in the life sciences sector have become or will be drug development companies. Mm-hmm. And this is to say that newly approved drugs have such a substantial impact on medical care. When you think about when I was in medical school, multiple myeloma was a death sentence. Mm. It's now, I won't say it's a chronic disease, but it's now the life expectancy has increased so tremendously over the years. I mean, relatively recently, the new drug Imbruvica in its treatment for lymphoma has, altered the course of therapy for that disease.
So would you say that is so I would say that's a good news story.
Yep.
Of where all of the players, the stakeholders in the process, including, I assume, the FDA, which we were talking about,
yep,
played their role right. How many stories are not good news stories and where things don't go right in that continuum?
Well, I think that the media often picks up on a lot of those stories. I would say that it's been interesting to me to watch how Valiant or Theranos or Martin Shkreli,
just want you to notice he mentioned Theranos first,
will dominate the headlines for an extended period of time. So I think that to the extent stories don't go right, they're covered and they're out there.
Carol, you and I were actually discussing the financial pathway. We were also discussing Theranos and why none of you were investors in that company. Can you take us down what you think is the healthy continuum for entrepreneurs, innovators, investors looking in this sector, what you think some of the pitfalls are?
Well, I agree with what was said about, what I think is tremendous about being in the biopharma industry, and I've been there almost 30 years now, is that unmet medical need and solving a problem for patients lines up with economic return. So if you do something great, like cure HCV, you should get rewarded. And that's what we're investing in. We're investing in true innovation that changes human health. Now, the challenge is it's very capital intensive, and it takes a long time. And those things are not sometimes easy for people to understand because we're in a society that wants it done tomorrow. And we want to believe, oh, surely there's a shortcut. But in drug development, there aren't shortcuts. You can be clever, you can be strategic, you can encourage a dialogue with the FDA to try to find a very efficient path, but you can't cut corners. And I think
so a single drop of blood is not enough.
Well, apparently not in that case, but you have to be data-driven. Mm-hmm. And so what I like about being an investor is I started as a data-driven person, and that's what really investing in biopharma is all about, is looking at the data, getting a great team that has a lot of experience about how to do drug development, and then giving them the capital and the opportunity to keep passing those milestones, but also being really self-disciplined when it's a no-go. The first company I was the CEO of was a company in Atlanta. I came in at the beginning of the Series B investment. They had done original chemistry out of Emory around a target called CXCR4 for cancer. They had set up a screen in the academic setting. It had then come into a company, and there was an original CEO who was a chemist who got it to IND stage, meaning it's ready to go into humans. And that's when I came into the picture. We were starting clinical trials in cancer patients with this drug. I started doing work to really look into what's our data set, how much have we really proven outside of the academic center that this hits the target it hits. I could not prove that it hit that target. I don't know what that compound is, but it doesn't hit CXCR4. Meanwhile, we're asking cancer patients to enter a trial. We have to stop that trial, of course, and we did as soon as possible. Within 6 months, sadly, but the right decision, we shut down the company and returned the remaining capital. Now, that wasn't exactly what I thought my first CEO gig was going to be.
But you survived it.
And it was the right thing to do because it is capital intensive, and every dollar that's going towards something like that isn't going to make it is a dollar that doesn't go towards something that's really important to be a breakthrough, like Drew was talking about in terms of myeloma, but also melanoma. There's so many places, lymphoma. We've made such progress in the last 10 years in cancer. It's really inspiring. So I think that's the really key thing is to recognize we've got to make really good decisions about where that capital goes.
Leon, I'm going to hold you for one more question because I don't want to go to you yet. But I want to ask the two of you because I know you've been an investor for a long time in this sphere we were talking about. You were just talking about your firm is actually going to celebrate its 40th anniversary. And you said something profound and disturbing a minute ago, Carol, where you said there are no shortcuts, it's not a slow process. But I think that what we've seen in things from our iPhone that's a decade old, others to the app, to the facility that we have with data today, the mass amounts of data, and kind of looking at the universe and the way gravity has changed, I guess my question to you is, why isn't it faster? Why are you satisfied with that question that there ought to be shortcuts? In my mind is telling me there ought to be ways to sort of move the game faster for humanity, if you will, given all of the technological advances we have. So talk, as Rachel Maddow would say, talk me down. Where am I wrong? And 40 years ago, I assume your firm was thinking about a certain way. 20 years ago, it was operating a certain way. 5 years, it was probably operating differently. So what have you learned in that trajectory about the changing ecosystem for both of you?
Well, so our firm invests in both tech and life sciences, and I think the founders, the reason they had the vision to do both is because they did believe it was going to be cyclical, and that the capital intensity in tech would be less and it would happen faster, and the capital intensity in life sciences would be more and it would happen slower. And if you invested across those two areas, you could then play out those peaks and troughs. And I think that's been the success of the firm. Now, the reason is that, and this is always hard for people who are technical, engineers, well, why isn't it simple? But people who are in medicine and biology recognize that biology is immensely complex. And unfortunately, we don't have very good models in animals to predict what happens in humans. We cure lots of mice, not so many humans. And that is the challenge about why it takes so long.
Drew?
Yeah, I often think that the only thing that biotech and tech share in common is the word tech.
Touché.
Drug development is a highly regulated industry. It's regulated when you think about it as a thought experiment. I mean, maybe Snapchat is harmful to the American public. I really don't think so. But the administering of new medication that hasn't been properly tested, at least historically, has not been great. And the FDA, when many years ago it didn't allow thalidomide to come into this country, as provided a high degree of safety for pregnant women at the time. That said, our industry has pushed the FDA and collaborated with the FDA largely to create certain paths that have allowed for accelerated approval under sort of unusual circumstances for cancer drugs, for certain drugs for
HIV.
infectious diseases such as HIV, which was actually the first drug ever approved on a surrogate endpoint, which is a technical term. But so there are expedited pathways. That said, the FDA is there to protect the American public. And I think, and I think that's the discussion we continue to have, to press forward, try and abbreviate the timelines to some extent, but as Carol said, to make sure that the appropriate studies are done. I think our industry generally has gotten much better at completing these types of packages and their submissions to the FDA, and that's also helped these timelines to some extent.
I'm going to have the Barack Obama's last FDA commissioner on stage in just a little bit. What, if he were still incumbent in his job, what would be the thing you would most say the FDA needs to fix?
Well, I think Rob Califf, having been at Duke before and having experience with clinical trials, really understands all of this and is sort of in an excellent position to balance the needs and wants of drug companies and or life science companies with sort of the appropriate regulation, and sort of was party to that because he's run clinical studies. So I would say that, again, the biggest cost to us as investors is, if you think about it, if you have a drug company and you have to wait 8 months for the FDA to respond to your letter, or 6 months, you're still paying all the people at that company for 6 months while you're waiting. So it's the ability of the FDA to quickly turn around the information they receive, determine what's complete, determine what's not complete, and make some sort of accurate assessment about what additional data they need to either approve your drug, suggest other studies, or ultimately, as Carol said, in circumstances that are not warranted, not approve your drug.
Leon, you have a model that I think is a bit different from what I understand, which is you actually invest and you actually help incubate and you actually take over as a CEO of some firms. I know you're driving a firm right now that's looking at the genetic drivers in Alzheimer's, and you're the CEO of that and running that, and you're at OrbiMed also. So I'm interested in that case where you're living this hybrid life, and I know I was reading about the fact that you're going to exit that, you're going to replace yourself with a CEO. Does the staff get depressed, or do they cheer when you leave?
Depends on the day of the week.
But I'm interested in the model of, you're in this area, and so it comes back to the question of why this specific arena, why did it look attractive to you, how's it going, and how is your sort of investor and incubator model comparing to the rest of the industry? Because it sounds like you're not the CEO of one of the firms you're investing in, right?
No.
So Carol's firm is diversified in terms of tech and healthcare. OrbiMed is 100% healthcare.
Right.
So we try and pride ourselves in being able to make an impact across the board in any asset type at any level, but all within the boundaries of healthcare. So given that kind of broad mandate, one aspect of what we do is actually to work at very, very early stages to either invest in new startup companies, but in some cases to actually build those companies ourselves. Carol highlighted the issue of management and people who have experience in doing drug discovery and development. That's unquestionably critical to having a successful outcome and maximizing the potential of any technology or any drug. I think similarly speaking, having, the role that I play is literally to make sure things get put together the right way, to identify those right people, matching them up with the right technologies, and creating not just a great technology to put money into, but finding the right people who can shepherd that and take that forward. The model, in terms of having me in, is kind of similar to what a lot of people use as entrepreneurs in residence. The problem with EIRs, at least in the healthcare industry, is because things take so long, you would have an EIR that may be brilliant, and they may start a company, and they end up running the company. You might see him or her again 15 years from now. And so the throughput of that is just not scalable. And so the idea is I'm sort of a rechargeable battery for them. If I can find great CEOs to end up running the companies that we end up incubating, then you can turn that over maybe every 18 to 24 months as opposed to every 7 to 15 years.
How many have you done that way?
So I've done 2 so far in the 4 years that I've been there. And hopefully they're not asking me to do another one and meet tomorrow, but there's always that kind of expectation that there's something else brewing in the background.
You know, one of the discussions that we often have in the sort of northeast quarter of the country on this is something that I don't hear as much about on the West Coast. Interesting why is the the property rights and sort of the periods of owning when we're an innovator. And I understand in the drug industry it's basically 12 years. Is that enough for you guys? Do you want more? Do you want less? How do you feel? I mean, I know that biotech is a bit different than the pharmaceutical sector, but it's something that sort of permeates all the discussions about the length of essentially monopoly stakeholding in these innovations. Drew?
Well, I think that the novel inventions are deserving of intellectual property, and that there is a strategy around intellectual property to establish through what's called a composition of matter patent, and then potentially extend that past to whatever term there is after a drug is approved. The issue usually raises its head, so to speak, if it takes an incredibly long time to develop the drug. And by the time you're 3/4 of the way through development, the patent itself is almost expired. Then one faces a strategic decision about whether it's worth all of, as Carol pointed out, the enormous amount of invested capital to then get a drug approved that no longer has any patent life whatsoever. So the FDA has weighed in to some extent on this as well, creating some.
Does that mean you've got a generic competitor at birth?
You in theory could initially. There are a variety of ways to increase or give new patent life for a number of years in a more abbreviated fashion, but I think that is the give and take around patent lives. And people forget, in a way, that in the United States and also around the globe, I mean, the total number of medication, i.e. pills sold, the vast majority of those sort of pills sold are generic. The number of novel drugs as a percentage of pills or vials is relatively small.
Carol, we were having fun talking. I mean, I'm sure all of you were bored by the show Silicon Valley because it's basically all about you, right? So you don't want to watch that. But we were talking about an episode where there was a fired CEO and talking to another CEO, and I don't understand it because you're talking about levels of money and whatnot that are ridiculously out of my experience. But I'm interested in how you sort of framed it, that when one was looking at valuations, I do know we have a lot of entrepreneurs out here, that you said he made a sort of mistake, that he made a mistake in the pathway of thinking about what a kind of stable pathway to growing a business was.
So it's really around this idea of valuation. And at every stage of investment, Series A, B, C, of course, what you ideally want as the CEO and as the syndicate to see the company making progress and getting a valuation markup to represent that progress. But in private companies, it's sort of all a made-up number. And I think sometimes CEOs get carried away with this idea of, oh, I got a $200 million valuation, isn't that awesome? If it's premature, it's terrible. Because if you can't live up to that valuation, you're probably going to be looking at a down round in the next round, and nobody likes down rounds. And so the Silicon Valley quip was this little bar scene where this CEO of a tech company was lamenting, oh, I just got fired because I took too high a valuation on the last round. We had to do a down round, and so the investors got rid of me. I had no idea I could have taken a lower valuation. And so it's this idea of you've got to, particularly in biopharma, play a really long game. And you have to think about the end in mind. And the other part about this is somebody ultimately has to sell that drug. And if the market is only sort of a revenue of $300 million versus $1 billion, and it costs $150 million to get there, you have to figure out how every investor class is going to be happy about their investment. And you have to work that out. So if you end up at too high a valuation, it doesn't work. So it's really about thinking carefully about the end game, working backwards, and trying to be as efficient as possible with your capital, get great investors that will stay with you and help you build your company, and valuation will come. It's just like we were talking about with unmet medical need. if you do something great for patients, the economics will work out. Yeah. So don't get so caught up with the ego of, oh, I need to have a 100% step up on this next round. That isn't how to think about it. It's the long game of how do I build my company.
Interesting. Julianne, let me ask you this question. I'm fascinated with Carol, and I'm not going to typecast her in this, but why do you think there are so few Carols out there in your industry, and what can be done to fix it?
Well, I mean, I don't know why. I don't know the answer why, but I do think that, historically there are probably, fewer women that end up going into science, fewer women that actually get recognized for the accomplishments that they have. It's not different from many other industries. It's a problem, right? How do you go about fixing it? I tend to believe in fixing it far more organically, recognizing people for their accomplishments.
I mean, do you think about inclusion questions broadly in your work, in your company, or is this sort of a luxury for the bigger firms?
Yeah, so I was telling Carol the story sort of on the side. So you mentioned I'm the CEO of an Alzheimer's company. We started the company a couple years ago and started staffing it with scientists. And I was sitting with our CSO in late December, sort of looking at the org chart, and I noticed, kind of without actually knowing this, that 80% of our scientists were women. Without that being a pre-specified intent of any kind, without us going out and branding ourselves in that way. And Carol had asked me if it was because they knew one another and they helped recruit one another. In some cases, yes, but in many cases, no. So I mean, for me personally, I think that the approach when I'm building these companies is really you're trying to hire the best possible people that you have. And I think if you take take it as a meritocracy and you actually kind of drive it in that way, it's a much more organic way of doing things, and frankly, just a good way that I like to sort of live my life. Frankly.
Drew, thoughts on this?
When I graduated from medical school in 1990, the majority of the class was male. The majority of Cornell Medical School classes now is women. I agree with Leon. I think it happens organically. I have a female partner at ACELink. We have a female analyst. And I would imagine as years go by, those numbers are only going to increase. I think it happens organically. There are a number of, Carol, of course, is unique. So, but putting her uniqueness aside, I think the rest of it happens organically over time.
Carol, quick thoughts?
I think it's important to let it happen organically, but with an awareness, because I think we don't want the pendulum to go too far the other way, because it only hurts women and minorities if we end up putting somebody who isn't the best candidate for that job in the role. It will quickly fall down as an opportunity. And so it's all about a meritocracy, find the best people, but I do think get out of your network, push yourself to find talent wherever talent is.
I'd like to go to the audience in a moment, but very quick, rapid round. Pretend we've all signed non-disclosure agreements and tell us what you think your moonshot, if you were to sort of think about areas in this field, you're all pros in this, deeply up to your gills in what this area, where do you think the next big opportunities are? I'd love to hear just sort of if you were to sort of skyball this, spitball this, where would you go next other than where you are now?
Well, I'd like to focus on areas where people aren't. I think they're great innovations in oncology. You heard a lot of examples that are going on now, and I tend to take the temperature by going to these therapeutic conferences that aren't so balmy with great news, right? That are somewhat depressing at some level because there's a lack.
What's the most depressing conference you've been to recently?
There have been a few.
You want to keep them secret.
Don't want to name names. But there are definitely some therapeutic areas where the pace of innovation just isn't there. And the things that, half the people there are physicians who are treating these patients, and you could see it on their face that they don't have a lot of options for their patients. And when they go to the conference, they're looking for the next big thing. And that next big thing doesn't look that exciting. I like to look at those particular areas, but then apply innovative technologies like the genomics revolution, for example. And this is how we came up with eScape and the Alzheimer's, is to take that as an example. You look at neurodegenerative disease, where there really are no options for Alzheimer's patients, Parkinson's patients that are disease modifying. And can we take innovations in discovering genetic markers, patient subpopulations, where you can make a difference for those people. Right. And I think that's that blending of that starts to bleed beyond oncology and orphan drug diseases and moving into things like CNS, renal disease, pulmonary diseases would be a very exciting sort of push to really recognize and create some value.
Carol?
I think I'm certainly interested in neurodegenerative diseases, so that's definitely a high one on my list. But I also think endocrine diseases that then span into orphan, I think are underrepresented. And then I would take that even as far to then go to such big issues as NASH. And so it's this whole challenge of how our metabolic state interacts with our endocrine state. And I think that is not an area that has been as much delved into in terms of company formation and opportunities.
Drew.
Well, they took all my good ideas.
Or you're a clever lurker.
I think, right, it's the sincerest form of flattery. I think that I agree. I think the central nervous system diseases first came imaging, and now with markers, we're doing a much better job of, I think, addressing, Leon talked about, Alzheimer's is still a difficult nut to crack. I'm hopeful he's going to crack it. Parkinson's, he mentioned, a number of other diseases. There was a company the other day that got sold that has a Parkinson's pump, which is extremely interesting. So I would expect that area, and depression. Time Magazine this week has a big article on depression. When I first graduated from medical school, everyone thought you were going to give people Prozac and everybody would be cured. That's not the case. I think there's a big opportunity there as well.
Great, thank you. Let me open up the floor to you. We got a gentleman right here in the middle.
Hi, Ben Miles from Transcriptic, we're a robotic cloud lab. I have an Adam Feuerstein tweet from yesterday. Biotech is in desperate need of a culling. You could probably kill 1/3 to 1/2 of publicly traded companies and be better for it. Agree? Disagree?
Ooh, interesting question. Publicly traded companies, kill them off, Carol?
I don't think so. I think what's been tremendous for the biopharma industry over the last 5 years is that we have had an IPO opportunity. And back to capital intensity, so we need the public investors to help us develop these drugs. And so it's been really important to be able to have access to that capital. So I don't see that at all, and I think there's been a number of great successes. Loxo's a great company that was started by a previous person that worked at Ainsley.
Provocative, though.
Very exciting.
Drew, you want to?
You know, I think it's really hard to separate the wheat from the chaff in that way. For instance, Pharmacyclics is a drug that was a company that had a lot of trouble for many years and then went on to develop one of the most important drugs in oncology. These things, as Carol said, they take time, they take capital. I think it's a provocative tweet. Take it as such, but
Interesting. Other questions, comments? Or I'm going to finish my. So let me ask you one. It's a little bit off in another field, but I at the Aspen Ideas Festival this year, which the Atlantic produces with the Aspen Institute, we had the head, I think, of global research for GSK there. So giant firm, largely in vaccines and other things. And as I understand, it's hard to make money in that area, but I don't quite believe them. But they're going to sell off their rare disease unit. And I found this fascinating, and I find the kind of broad question of structures. When you were just talking about orphan issues, I also worry about the next pandemic coming in and whether there's an infrastructure globally deployed that's paid for, and how to get at that nexus of large firms actually there, creating the science, working with universities, putting this in, which really is a public good, but also getting the balance with private gain. And I just want to tap your brains for what should we be doing on the international front that we're not doing, and are you worried?
Personally, I think it's a broader issue than just the international front. I think we have a lot of great alignment right now, as Carol mentioned earlier, in terms of economic incentives with respect to finding cures for diseases. I don't believe that alignment exists for preventative type of diseases. I think that when you look at the impact on public health that vaccines or other preventative types of treatments can provide, the economic incentives for those largely don't exist today, in my opinion. And I think if there's any place where there's an opportunity to sort of better align those incentives so cash will start flowing in that direction, that would have a tremendous impact on public health in the long run.
Very cool answer. I had no idea we were going to go there. But Carol?
I think an example of this is what's been happening in infectious disease.
Yeah.
And so for quite a while in the sort of 2004, 5, 6, 7 timeframe, the FDA made it more challenging for companies to have a regulatory path to get novel antibiotics approved. And Congress responded and did the Gaines Act. And the Gaines Act not only created a better regulatory environment, but it also created government funds that can be grants to companies to help novel antibiotics get developed. And that's really important because we all know resistance continues to occur. It will occur. We haven't yet found a solution for that, so we definitely need new antibiotics. So I think that's an example where policy did change the whole environment, and there are a number of new antibiotic companies and new antibiotics that are being developed that we're going to all need someday with hospital-acquired infections.
Thank you. Drew, can you fix this problem?
I guess I could slightly restate what they said because I agree with both of them. I think that I think that the FDA provides leadership around the globe in regulatory matters, and almost all other countries tend to reflect to some degree what the FDA has done. So it matters in other sovereign nations, whether they're in Africa or wherever they are, that they pay attention to what the FDA does. And those nations, as Leon said, they need to create sort of economic incentives. Now, GSK has a big franchise in HIV. They're in Africa. They're a global concern. For a smaller biotech company to sort of scale that height, so to speak, it takes a fair amount of time. First, they're coming in the US, then in Europe, so it takes a bit of time, but I just would concur with what they said.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please give Drew Schiff, Carol Gallagher, and Leon Chen a hand. Thank you very much for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.